Hello, my name is Ali Cameron and I am an archaeologist. I was in the City of Aberdeen Archaeological Unit for 24 years and I carried out a number of excavations which tell us a lot about the archaeology of the medieval city and its surroundings. So I'm going to give you an introduction to that today. So this is Parson James Gordon's map of 1661, which shows the city at that point. We can see some familiar sites here, so St Nicholas Church, Broad Street, where Marshall College is in here, and the Castle Gate here. This is the toll booth, which is still there within the Sheriff Court. And some of the hills, which again you can still see the Castle Hill. Union Street now comes in through here. And of course the harbour area here, which has all been developed, and of course the areas round about, which were fields at that time. This gives us a really good idea of what the city looked like during the medieval period, because although this is late medieval, post-medieval, the city would not have changed a huge amount since then. And so when we're looking at an area of the city, we use this fantastically detailed map to give us an idea of what might be under the ground. So essentially we know that by the 12th century Aberdeen was a big port and a thriving city. But even before that we have evidence that the city was on the go, before the 12th century. So the city was divided into 4 quarters, and so you had, you can see here the even, the green, fitty and crooked. Now, the green still survives, so there's an area in the city called the Green, down near the harbour, near the railway station. Fitty, of course, is this ward here which takes you up to the Castle Gate, but of course now Fitty is further down towards the harbour, and Crooked and Even, which of course are not really survive in any way, apart from if you go into the city and find Crooked Lane. I won't tell you where that is, but if you go into the city, there is a lane that is crooked and called Crooked Lane. So these areas define the city, and they shut off an area where most of the people would have lived within the city, and they were protected by gates or ports. So you can see ones here, Fitty, one on the way into the Green, in Upper Kirkgate, and so the gates would be shut if there was a danger to the city, so attack or disease, and there is evidence that they were shut at times, under those circumstances. We don't have one surviving, unfortunately. Some cities do, but we don't because of more recent development. But this is a fantastic illustration which was done of the possible Justice Port, so in Justice Street, which is just off the Castle Gate. And you can see obviously a larger entrance for carts. There would probably been one for people too. And you can see the toll booth in the background here. So it may have looked something like that. They would have needed to be substantial to obviously protect the city. Within those quarters, you then got subdivisions into different people's properties. So this is actually old Aberdeen, similar situation, that within the areas they would have been dividing lines of some sort, and so these ditches here appeared to be dividing properties. They were a little bit less easy to see, but ones that we found in Aberdeen itself, actually we can see those on Parson Gordon's map. So this ditch here was dividing 2 properties under what's now the Bonaccord Centre. So if you go to the Upper Kirkgate section of the Parson Gordon's map, you can see these properties on the frontage here, each with a strip of land going to the back, and then longer backlands. So we would call this the foreland and the backland. So within those backlands, a lot of activity would have been taking place, and I will tell you a little bit more about that. One of the things we do know is that all of the rubbish was thrown away during the medieval period into these backlands. So either into these pits, and this is an amazing pit with all these different layers in it, or just into a midden spread like this here. So there would have been dirt and mess and stink all over the place until Scaffy, some of you will know Scaffy's, the refuse collectors, is a sort of late medieval name, and I think about in the late 17th century they were started to be appointed in Aberdeen to clean the lanes and closes on a daily basis. This is one of the streets. This is near, just opposite Marshall College, off Broad Street. And we found this. Now, this doesn't look particularly like a lane, but if you imagine streets with cobbles, stones pressed into soil and clay, and then rolled over all the time with carts and animals and people, their streets would have been fairly poor condition a lot of the time. And so this, we think, is part of the what we would call the guest row. And so going back to Parson Gordon's again, we look at this, for all sorts of different purposes. But again, here you can see the guest row. Well, Bredgate, Broadgate, so where Marshall College is now. This is the area of the guest row here that I was just showing you. And again, you can see that the plots, the backlands, all coming off a street frontage here. So our excavation that I was just showing you was in the back here, and this gives you a lot of idea of the details of Parson Gordon's map. And we know a little bit about water supply. So on Parson Gordon's map, you've got this marsh called the Loch, which is maintained in streets Aberdeen Loch Street. You can see the Denburn here. This is another part of the map from the west of Aberdeen, where some of you will know the Denburn still runs through the West End and through Rosemount down and joins the River Dee near the harbour area. And these would have both supplied water to businesses and houses throughout the medieval period. We know some people had wells, and we haven't found huge numbers in the city centre, but this is one that we excavated down near the harbour itself. And we also know that people sunk water butts, so sunk wooden barrels into the ground that would have collected water. And this is one that we excavated in Upper Kirkgate on the site of the Bon Accord Centre. And generally what you find in these when you've excavated them, so this is a barrel fully excavated, is that they contain things like jugs, which would have been used obviously to collect the water out of them, but also things like cat bones and bones where things would have got thrown into the well. So you might imagine that having all these water supplies, their water would have been very fresh. In fact, it's unlikely, because if they were polluting water with things like cats and other animals, we know that the loch itself was very, very badly contaminated by the medieval period because of all the industry around the loch area. And even if you were wealthy enough to have running supplied water, so this is actually the Carmelite Friary site, and this is a lead pipe in a stone culvert here, and this is clay which had been used to put round a lead pipe, but then had been opened and stripped out and the lead taken out. This is the Carmelite Friary Church here with the buttresses. And this is a copper alloy spigot or tap from the Carmelite Friary. So you would have thought these monks would have had a lot of, would have been fairly wealthy, would have had a running water supply, but of course they would have also had very high levels of lead in their body. So even if you had what's technically a fresh water supply, you would have been drinking contaminated water in one form or another. So talking a little bit about the animals and about agriculture, these are actually some woodcuts that we prepared for a book which we wrote in 2001 about the medieval digs that we'd done in the city, and you can get that online or in the library. But we know that even within the city there was agriculture. So these are plough marks, again in an area in the city near the Carmelite Friary, down in the green, so near the railway station in Aberdeen. Some of you will be more familiar with seeing Rig Furrow, for example. So this is a golf course out to the west of Aberdeen, where you can see Rig Furrow surviving, where it's been. So you've got the ridge here that's mounded and the furrow, and then of course modern ploughing normally takes that away. But if you've got areas like this which haven't been very disturbed, or areas underneath an excavation, you do see furrow marks or Rig Furrow fairly regularly on excavations in and around the city. And of course, the animals that they had were very varied. We found a lot of cattle, pigs, sheep, and goat, and these would have been, of course, for meat, for hides, for milk, and we can tell from the age of the animals when they died what they were being kept for. Obviously, older animals being kept for milk, and younger animals for hides and meat. We know they were doing a lot of fishing in the city. We've obviously got the two rivers and the sea. So this is again a snapshot of Parson Gordon's maps. You can see fisher shells here, and you can see this wonderful little net here with the little boat and the guys pulling in the net. And we found bits of boats occasionally, little bits of wood. This is a sort of coracle style, so it would have been a wooden frame or a wattle frame. You can see here woven wattle with a hide exterior. But this, we found a couple of paddles on excavations, just wooden shaped handle here and blade. And we know that fish made up a large proportion of the wealth of Aberdeen. So the two main exports were woolfells and salmon. So we can tell a little bit about what they were doing with the salmon as well when we find cut marks or holes within the bones. So we know that some of these bones come from cod and ling, which are 1.5 meters long. So these huge, great big fish were being caught not only inland and near the harbour, but also in deep sea. And you can see little cuts and marks on them. You can sometimes see holes in them where they've been strung up to dry. And so we get a really good idea of what they were doing with these animals. And then the hinterland was really important to Aberdeen because obviously people couldn't raise lots of flocks of sheep within the city. So within 1 to 2 walking days from Aberdeen, they would have farms, obviously the land that they would have farmed. And these are rare to find structures like this, but this is actually an Tor Guard archaeology found this barn 14th or 15th century on an excavation a few years ago, and so we're starting to get an idea of where the medieval farms were. But as I say, few and far between. Although around the city there are lots of mentions on Canmore and Past Map of medieval sites, but a lot of these, of course, are not all farming sites. There's also churches and various other buildings. So I want to talk a little bit more about sort of commerce. We have evidence of trading, so we have it in various forms. So Aberdeen has a lot of coin hoards. Many are known and were reported in the newspapers in the 18th and 19th century as building was taking place within the city. This top one here is a copper alloy pot. The coins don't survive from that, and it was found in Upper Kirkgate. But these two pots were found in 1983 and 84, and they are local medieval jugs that have had the rim taken off, so purposely had the rim taken off them. And in the hoards altogether, you can see the dates of some of the 7,000 coins altogether within the two hoards, and coins from Alexander II, Edward I, Robert the Bruce. As I say, found on an extension to the St Nicholas Centre where Marks and Spencer's is today. So we know people were trading, were wealthy. We've got a range of different types of money and vessels found. You can see here some of the coin hoards that have been found. And we have other manufacturing evidence. So we have things like we have this this oak object here, which was actually for weaving. So it was called a weaving sword, and it was used for threading warp and weft threads. We have weights for the bottom of the loom. We have some cloth which may have been made locally, or may have come from, say, local wool that was exported and imported. We've got shears here and needles, for example. And this paddle is interesting because although it looks like it might be the end of an oar, as I was talking about, the experts actually think that it was maybe for flax processing. So when you're using flax threads, you actually have to beat them to get the usable bit of the flax out. So these are all to do with the production of cloth, which was a very important, again, in Aberdeen, the wool being exported. You can see here the spindle whorls. If you're not sure how cloth's made, you've got the spindle whorl on the bottom, and that's spun. And you can see here this is an upright loom. So you've got the weights on the bottom and then the weaving sword used to put the threads through. And again, as I say, some of the textile here, which we've excavated from, and all of this comes from medieval sites in Aberdeen. And yes, and this is for flax processing. So you had to beat the flax threads like that. This is from a manuscript illustration. And we know also that because there were a lot of animals, there were also a lot of hides, and so we have tanning pits. So this was from the Upper Kirkgate, Gallowgate area of the city, and they would have dug these pits and put into it bark, so things like oak, which have lots of tannins in them, and then you would have basically had things like urine and other materials within there, and you put in then the skins of animals, and the tannins go into it and create leather. We found an awful lot of offcuts of leather, so some sort of complete or nearly complete shoes. You can see these have been very worn, and we do find repaired ones as well. Offcuts from the uppers of boots, and sheaths for holding things like knives. And so we have a really good idea of which areas were being used for these really sort of smelly occupations like tanning. And this area where we found all of these shoes in the Gallowgate area was near the loch. And I said that the Loch of Aberdeen was polluted. Well, these people who were making these shoes and repairing them would have been contributing towards that pollution. We have a lot of information about house and home, so we excavate often bits of buildings, so foundations, and obviously things that were in the house and home. So we often get roof slates, so as wattle and daub buildings with thatch roofs, we have samples from those and we've identified them. We then get stone, used routinely within buildings. We have floor tiles, mainly from the friaries and churches in Aberdeen. We get planks of wood and wooden nails, iron nails. So we get a really good idea on a dig of what a building might have looked like. So this is the corner of a post and wattle building that we excavated underneath the Bonaccord Centre. So it would have been a building like this. So stakes put into the ground, twigs woven through them, and then daub, which is clay, manure, mud, put onto the outside of the house to make it watertight. Slightly later, so in the sort of late medieval period, you're starting to see stone foundations often. And this is actually a very particular building. That this is, again, Parson Gordon in the bottom. And it says here a dry ground sometimes overflowed. And so this was an area that has now been reclaimed. But at the time, they were building on these stone foundations, we think. So maybe something like this with a post and wattle building above, but stone foundation below. And this is a fantastic medieval cellar that we excavated. This is in the Academy site. So if you go into the Aberdeen Academy site, in the centre there's a courtyard with cafes. Underneath that we found this building when they were doing the building works there. And so it was a stone foundation. So it's 13th to 15th century and a stone foundation and cellar. And this is it actually here, just so that you can see. This is St Nicholas Church, backwind, and this is the remains of this building here, which we were really surprised to find because you can see on Parson Gordon's map that there's just fields there. And so for some reason this building got built and then probably forgotten about by the time of Parson Gordon's map. And we can't really explain that. We're not sure whether it was to do with one of the friaries, possibly the Blackfriars is just over here. And that building had steps down at one time. You can see that when we've excavated, you can see the steps. Um, and then latterly there was a clay ramp put in, which suggests probably a change of use, that you were going from steps to a ramp, maybe suggesting you're either having animals coming into them or you were rolling something down like barrels. And we find a lot of pottery. So in a domestic setting, we would be finding lots of pots like this. So charred on the outside, cooking pots, and this is a medieval type. And also other slightly more unusual. You can see this as some people call this a Dutch oven, and it's a half a pot. So you can see here that it's just half a round pot. But it's only been charred on this side, so the rim's not really charred and the bottom's not charred. And we think it was for putting into a fire, maybe almost in the ground, and so only the side of it, this side here, was getting charred, and it was for particular types of cooking, particular types of meat, for example. We get this is again the Upper Kirkgate hoard pot. But this was a cooking pot at one time, and it would have more likely these metal pots would have hung over a fire like this, or sat next to a fire on the ground. And we find evidence of wood often in Aberdeen. It was a waterlogged city, so the clay subsoil underneath and the waterlogging has meant that the survival of things like wood is very, very good. This is actually a piece of furniture which was again excavated in Upper Kirkgate on the Bonaccord Centre site, and specialists think that it was either a part of a cask or a chair, so like a kist or storage chest, or a piece of furniture like a chair. And we find evidence of things like games, and so within houses, obviously families would have lived there, and people would have played games. So we've got things like counters. These are both bone, again, often survives really, really well. A little rounded counter here, and then obviously a die in the top here, and we do find them on sites, and we know people played games. This is a little knuckle bone of a pig, and we quite commonly find them on excavations, and there's a bit of discussion about whether they're toggles for a coat, for example, but there's been quite a lot of ethnographic work done on these, and so a lot of archaeologists call them buzz bones, because if you put a string through the hole like this and whir it round, it makes quite a buzzing noise. And anthropologically, kids collect these bones when a pig is slaughtered and put a hole in them to make these toys. We found dress ornaments, so things like buckles and brooches and buttons and pins, a lot of things like buckles. So we know that they would have had belts and things, leather belts that would have been tied with these buckles, and pins for hair and for clothing. So if you had a cloak, you wouldn't, the easiest way is just to pin it shut. So we do find lots of pins and lots of little pins. And things like combs. So this is an antler comb with a antler body here with copper alloy rivets and obviously antler teeth here. And we occasionally find other bone things like this lovely little sort of flute, which we think may have been something like, well, this is a chanter, obviously from the pipes, but we haven't got quite enough of this to say exactly how it was played, but I'm sure there would have been music, and we find evidence of things like that too. So within the home, in the medieval period, a lot of the homes of the sort of ordinary people of Aberdeen would have been in the backlands. They would have been made of post and wattle. They would have had a central hearth, so we excavate them as well, and the smoke would have gone out through the roof. So there would have been very little ventilation. You can see a door here and a little light above, but they would have been dark, they would have been smoky, they would have been smelly. They would have had everything that they needed in there, so they would have had all their pots and animals, things to do with spinning and weaving and the different cooking that they were doing. And we have a bit of evidence of the food that they were eating. We have samples and we find seeds. We obviously have we have things like toilets, so we have the remains from there that we can tell what they were eating. We also have things like bread ovens. So this is a circular area of clay and stones, which we think would have had a superstructure over it. So post and wattle with clay on the top, like they made the buildings, but more like a little oven like this, where they would have made bread, and probably cooked other things as well. But this gives you an idea of what the backland would have been like. So out with the house, there would have been a garden, which would have had animals that they were able to keep. So a family might have a pig, a couple of hens. Not many people would have had a horse or a cow. There's a horse here. There would have been a stables, obviously, on the frontage. And of course, they would have grown things that they needed and had cooking. We find lots of pots that are associated with eating, drinking, and cooking. So lots of jugs, which would have this would have been This was imported into Aberdeen from the Low Countries, the grey one, and it would have come into Aberdeen with things like wine, figs, and olives, and then would have been reused on a table in Aberdeen. This is a really nice jug, which we found nearly every piece of it but broken. You can see that it's been lovingly stuck together again. But when we excavated, it got called the bear pot because there are 3 faces on it. And it was made in the medieval period in Lincolnshire, and is really unusual, but a very, very large pot. And some fantastic 3-dimensional pots. These are called knight jugs, knight with a K. So this is a knight in a suit of armour on a horse prancing around the top of the jug. And we rarely find a big bit of a jug, but we'll find the shield, we'll find the heads. So you can see 2 heads here from one of these sort of knight jugs. And we find pottery really commonly, but glass much less so. It's obviously much more fragile, and medieval glass is very rare. There's 3 pieces here. This has got a trail blue decoration on it. The glass on the right is just to show you what types of vessels that we might get. And most of this glass is found on the monastic sites, so on religious sites. And so on to talking about the religious sites. I mean, I've been lucky to excavate at the Carmelite site, at the Greyfriars at Marshall, and also at the Blackfriars. So that's 3 of the 4 friaries that we had in medieval Aberdeen, and also at St Nicholas Kirk. This is a plan showing those sites there. So the Blackfriars, where the art gallery is, the Greyfriars, where Marshall is, St Nicholas Church, obviously in the centre, and the Carmelite here, who are the White Friars. Now the Red Friars, the Trinitarians, that area has been redeveloped, and so we haven't got evidence of that. But interesting that some of these churches are out with the ports or gates. So St Nicholas and the Dominican Friary were out with the ports. So we wonder why they didn't need to be protected. We're not sure why that is. So St Nicholas Kirk, I'll just tell you a little bit about, first of all, the excavation produced 4 medieval churches. This is a semicircular apse, which is the earliest wall standing in Aberdeen at the moment, and it's 11th or early 12th century, and it had the burials of 25 small children radiating out from it. You can see the burials here with the little individuals in situ here. And there's a big piece taken out of this because much later burials had come in and had been sunk in and had taken out any earlier evidence. This is one of the little kist burials, so little stones placed around to make a little stone coffin. And some of the burials were in wooden logs, so you can see here this burnt wooden log here. And then by the sort of middle 12th century, they had built a rectangular church. So this is the buttresses and the east wall of a medieval church, 12th century church. And it had associated, well, these were buttresses with it, and associated graveyards. So we had several hundred individuals, many of whom wanted to be buried as close to the east end of this church as possible. So you can see them all here. We have a lot of information about these individuals, which I can't really go into detail now, but several of the individuals had been to Santiago de Compostela in the north of Spain on pilgrimage and had come back with pilgrims' badges. So this is a scallop shell, which was over the thigh of an individual, 2 near the head. You can see they're all pierced so that they can be attached onto clothing. We find some with wooden rods, and this is a pilgrim at Santiago, so that's him with his wooden rod. He's got scallop shells on his hat, and he would have one on his bag as well, so and on his cloak. So we know a lot of the people who were buried there were wealthy, and some were wealthy enough to go to Santiago de Compostela. We found this middle-aged female who had very bad vitamin D deficiency as an adult, and when we lifted her pelvis, we found this lead token, which is called a PHR, which is the Virgin Mary with the body of Jesus over her knee, and it's very, very they're very rare, these tokens. St Mary's Chapel, which was part of St Nicholas Church in the medieval period, was dedicated to Our Lady of Pity. And it may be that this woman came to Aberdeen to be healed at the shrine of St Mary in Aberdeen and bought that here, or maybe had been as a pilgrim somewhere else and had bought this token and then died and been buried with it. This was the dig as it was going on, and you can see that these huge, great big walls here formed part of the 15th century church, which was built over the 12th century church. And within that 15th century church, we uncovered a set of stairs which had been vaulted. You can see the brick vaulting here, and it would have taken you between the different levels in the church in the medieval period. In the later use of the church, we found a lot of clothing associated with the individuals, and so you can see here one of several complete hats that we found excavated. Just a note here, you can see how well preserved some of the later coffin wood was. This was a coffin, and this is the really nice lower legs of an individual. Bows, they're brown, unfortunately, on brown soil, but bows which would have been a sort of Knickerbocker style clothing which this person was buried in. And we have really exciting news about a lot of the textiles which we'll be sharing with people in the future. The Blackfriars, as I said, is near the art gallery. So this is the art gallery on the frontage of School Hill. And we went in about 10 years ago and did a small watching brief when they were putting new surfaces in here, and we found bits of stone wall. But then a later piece of work 5 or 6 years ago, we were watching cabling being put in for a new electricity substation. And we found, well, actually the workmen first of all found some bones, and I then excavated. This is me excavating that skeleton. And then we went on to find quite a number of other burials. So this was a trench which they were putting lots and lots of cabling, and you can see the burials here. So we found about 30 individuals in this phase of the work. 3 had stones within their mouths, which was really unusual, and we have yet to work out exactly why. Stones are put in people's mouths to stop them talking, to stop the devil getting out, getting in, and so we're not really quite sure, because it's likely that these males were actually belonged to the friary, so were Blackfriars. And so we had, well, 25 altogether. There was actually a few other individuals which were quite disturbed. We've got 2 that possibly had brucellosis, which is a disease which is contracted from dairy products, and so it's quite likely these people maybe were in occupation to do with looking after animals, and so maybe the friars at the Blackfriars were, kept animals. And then about a year later, another company, AOC Archaeology, did the excavation under the art gallery, and they also found quite a number of skeletons. And you'll maybe have seen this. There's been a number of talks about it, about the reconstructed face of one of these men that they excavated. So altogether, we've got over 100 individuals, and that's not published yet, but we're working on the publication of that. And then the Carmelites, I mentioned the Carmelites earlier. So we had early agriculture from this site, and It was, well, founded around about 1273, and so we found evidence of the earliest buildings. Um, this was the ongoing excavation. You can see the Carmelite church wall here and excavating graves within the site. The earliest church itself was probably wood, and we found hundreds of post holes, which seem to indicate quite a complex that was built, maybe in the late 13th century when the White Friars, the Carmelites, arrived, and they built in wood prior to then building in stone. But these are the buttresses of the Carmelite friary. This was an area which was very boggy. I mentioned the Denburn and the Dee earlier. Well, this site is very close to the junction of those two rivers, and so it was a very wet area. So you can see that they've built a foundation or a raft of stone onto which the stone building was constructed. We found one of the doors in the north wall, and it had these two beautifully sculptured sandstone blocks marking it out. We also found mason's marks. Some of you will know these are marks which are put onto blocks of stone to show how much a mason and his team have worked, so how much therefore they're going to get paid. And we had two which were an M with a tail, so like that, an M with a tail, on two blocks, one on the north side of the friary and one on the south. So all of it built by the same group of masons. We had evidence of flooring. This scarcement or step here inside the church was where the first wooden floor would have been laid. But we know that the floor was replaced many, many times. We've got a lot of ceramic tiles at the top here, including some really horrible tiles, which we think were made locally, but were probably never or not heavily used. They were seconds. They had a ridge round them where they'd attached onto the tile below in the kiln. We've also got a lot of roof slates, so we can talk a lot about what the buildings look like. We've got long, thinner slates and huge ones, and also window glass. So although at the Reformation in 1560, people came and dismantled these buildings, they left enough for archaeologists to determine what buildings look like, what their glazing schemes were like. We found some hearths, so we found a domestic range where the building was where the friars would have lived. They would have cooked, and they would have done other things like reading, and so we have this stone hearth, and underneath it there was also a ceramic hearth. I mentioned in the water supply, this was us lifting part of the clay surround for the lead pipe and lifting some of the lead pipe out of the ground to sample it. And we know that they had problems with water too, because these fantastic medieval cobbles, which also surrounded the church, had drains all the way around, and areas where they went into soakaways, which would have taken the water away from the church and into drains around about the site. And of course, we found a lot of burials there too. So around the inside of the church, we had lines of small babies and small children's burials here. And we think they were maybe put right next to the wall to protect them from being excavated by later burials. Some of the burials were very, very poorly preserved. So these were dug just into clay, in no coffins, we don't think, these ones. And you can see the bone is very poorly preserved. But some are much better preserved, where you can see the outline of the wooden coffins here, and the bone much, much better preserved. And of course, from the human remains, and a lot of you will be doing human remains courses, you can tell a lot about people's lives. So on the left, we have tuberculosis, where infection has damaged the spine of this individual. And of course, dental decay. They would have had a lot of poor teeth, so caries within the teeth, and then abscesses getting into the teeth. So this is an abscess in the mandible of one of the individuals. And we also have several individuals who died through fighting. So either at war or interpersonal violence of some sort, so falling out with your neighbour, but this is a sword wound to the head here, and you can see a really sharp wound here, which has actually cracked the skull. Now, this person didn't die immediately because a surgeon or somebody has come in and made cuts around the wound, which suggests that they tried to do an operation. They took the scalp off and they took the bit of bone away, but unfortunately there's no healing, so the person died really, really quickly. And we have some personal items, not a huge number from the Carmelite site. They weren't really buried with personal items, but this was one individual male here who had this decorated bracelet round his wrist. And when I first went into the newly opened art gallery, I was really pleased to see one of the displays showed that the Walker Road School had picked this medieval bracelet to do a display about, and this lovely display about this monk and what his life would have been like and why he might have had a bracelet on. And so from the Carmelite Friary site, we had we had a die, we had quite a number of coins, some of which were in the wall foundation, so it helped us with our dating. Lots of things like these little book fittings. So these would have been hammered onto the books and caskets. So we know that the Carmelites would have had quite a good library, and also things like fittings for on buckles, so items of clothing as well. And we actually know so much about the site that we were able to draw some images of what it might have been like. So this is coming from the green and going down a vennel into the north wall, through the north wall of the Carmelite Friary into the church here. We have created 3D images of what the inside of the church might have looked like. And we have a really good bit of information from the dig and from Parson James Gordon's map about the layout of the building. So this was several years excavation prior to the area being developed, has allowed us to get a really good idea of what, these buildings look like, what people's lives were like. And this has been published in Internet Archaeology, so you can go in to Internet Archaeology free and go in, and there's a 2.5-minute video of what the friary might have been like. It sort of takes you through it. And then on to the Franciscans, so the Greyfriars at the Marshall College site. It was a much later foundation, 1469, and so therefore it was on the go for less than 100 years before the Reformation. But this medieval church survived until 1903, when it was demolished to make way for the buildings on the frontage of Marshall College now. And so because it was so late, there are photographs of it being demolished and also pictures of it drawn by architects. And when we were doing work for Marshall College to be converted into Aberdeen City Council headquarters, we found a section of the church wall here with the plaster on. Unfortunately, it had been all dug round, but it only survived because it was being used as a foundation for a pillar, an early 20th century pillar at the site. And we did a lot of excavations in lots of different areas, but one of the most interesting things we found were the burials of 7 people here. You can see them. There's a wall here, which would have been one of the walls of the cloister of the friary, so the garden essentially of the friary. And these people were buried with their heads right next to this wall. And all 7 of them were buried with their hands clasped in prayer like this. So you can see this was us in the grave taking pictures of the beautifully and carefully excavated hands. There's another picture here to show you the different angle of that. And all of these individuals were very elderly. So they were all male and they were all elderly. They had very poor teeth falling out. And they showed evidence of having had a really rough childhood, so lines on their teeth indicating periods of poor nutrition or ill health when they were young. And one of the individuals had fish bones within the stomach area, so within the pelvic area, and you can see the bones here. And when we were doing sampling with Cape Breton, we found that one of the skulls had hair on the back of the head. So a lot of you will be doing courses with Kate and you'll be looking at oxygen isotopes. And so we've been doing some research into this, but we haven't got the results to publish yet. But we're hoping that when we finish the isotope analysis, we'll be able to find out a little bit more about these individuals. We have lists of the names of the friars and the year they died, what they did, and the name and the year they died. And you can see some of these are much more local names, so Strang, Jemison, and some of these are not local names like Strang potentially. Van, sorry, is probably not a local name. And so we're wondering if these people came into the friary from abroad, and hopefully the oxygen isotopes will be able to tell us that in the future. And then I just want to talk a little tiny bit about, I haven't talked much about Old Aberdeen, but St Michael's Cathedral in the early 12th century, and the chapel started in 1500. Now, when historians were looking at the chapel, they told me that there was nothing on the site prior to the chapel, which was built in starting around 1500. But we excavated there before they put a new organ in about 15 years ago, and we found a burial. So you can see the cut for a burial here, and we found a couple of bones which are in very, very poor condition. But we had them radiocarbon dated to 1030 to 1220 AD. And this is one of the mysteries of archaeology, that sometimes you find something that's really difficult to explain. So was this a grave at a site 500 up to 500 years before the chapel was built, or is this a body that's been moved? So when the chapel was built in 1500, was that a body that was moved into place? Unfortunately, because this was very disturbed by later digging, you can see bricks and all sorts of things in it. We can't tell. But also, one of the intriguing things was that outside, when the scaffolding was up, they found some holes in between the stones, and when they removed the mortar, they found these jugs bedded into the wall, and they were late 15th, early 16th century, so contemporary with the structure. And why they were there, we're really, really not sure. But there's been various suggestions, including for encouraging bees to nest, but we're really not sure why they were there. And then just the last slide, we got a lot of information about medieval Aberdeen, and so we can start creating these wonderful images. This was drawn by Jan Dunbar of a boat coming into through the harbour into Fitty, which would have been just a small set of little cottages, and into the harbour here, and you can see the skyline of Aberdeen. And so it really pays off to study a city for such a long time and do such a lot of excavation, because it gives you a really good idea of what that city was like in the past. Thank you very much.